Hey, everybody, welcome into DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. My name is Brandon Adams. We're presented today by Merriweather and Tharp, and we're going to be joined by Jeff Sintel, DawgNation's recruiting insider, here in just a couple of minutes. A couple of fun things to get into with Jeff, and maybe one not quite so fun thing to get into. We'll do all of that here. Also, let me kind of give you a little bit of a preview of what's going to be in the podcast later on today. Georgia coach Kirby Smart made a radio appearance in Atlanta today on 680 The Fan and touched on a number of subjects. A couple of those we'll dive in a little deeper on the podcast, including, I think, really interesting, what Smart said would be the key in terms of seeing offensive changes this upcoming year. A metamorphosis taking place under new offensive coordinator Todd Monken and potentially led by quarterback Jamie Newman. Smart says it depends on those playmakers, those guys that Georgia looks to get the football to. He mentioned George Pickens by name. He mentioned Zamir White by name. He mentioned James Cook by name. Three interesting names to hear there, all for various reasons. We will deal with that with the podcast today and also with Jeff Sintel coming up. Let me remind you, as I said before, Merriweather and Tharp makes it all possible today. Your source for Georgia divorce. And listen, when I bring on Jeff Sintel, there's nothing more fun than talking UGA recruiting. There's nothing more fun than thinking about the upcoming season. But let's face it, some of you right now are dealing with something that's decidedly less than fun. You may be a part of a relationship that's severed. You may be a part of a relationship that you've tried to rebuild, but as of now, it just seems irreparable. And if that's your case, my prayers go out to you. My advice is also to make sure you have an advocate on your side. That's what Merriweather and Tharp is. You may be going through this for the first time, but Merriweather and Tharp has been through this thousands of times. Bob, Jason, the whole team over there, they are very, very generous with their time, with their expertise, setting you up on a path to be made whole again with your family relationship, with your finances, with everything else. They'll do a lot of the work for you, be an advocate on your side. But the first step belongs to you. Got to reach out to them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com, and that'll get you in touch with my friends at Merriweather and Tharp. With that said, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, let's transition over for some UGA recruiting talk. We'll bring in our buddy Jeff Sintel here on the program today. And Jeff, as I say hello to you, and obviously we get ready to talk some recruiting, let me at least begin on the subject that we're kind of already dealing with a little bit here today. That's some of what Smart said when he made the Atlanta radio appearance a little earlier on 680 The Fan. I want to deal with that here just for a moment, because I think when we think about those offensive changes, and Smart was asked about that directly today, how different will it look under Todd Monken? How different will it look with what we presume to be Jamie Newman as the starting quarterback? Smart says, well, it kind of depends on those playmakers and who you get the ball to, guys like Pickens and guys like Cook and guys like White. Jeff, on the one hand, that sounds really good to me because obviously those are names that I'm interested in. On the other hand, man, it sounds an awful lot like what James Coley said before the start of last season, and ultimately we know how those results turned out. When you hear those kinds of things from Smart, or just generally speaking about how you think the offense is going to look this year, how does all that land with you?
I think the coaching conjecture, and by the way, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Brandon. Good to be with you. I think the coaching conjecture is what it is. The ball plays, getting guys in space. I mean, Brandon, you almost have a whisker on your face for how many times people have mentioned D-Rob, and you're going to see more out of James Cook this season when it comes to a Georgia offense. I think the thing here is key to me is the players. And players, I mean, you'll have a quarterback, likely a dual threat in Newman or Mathis, that will maybe change the way defenses go after Georgia's front and also that offensive attack. The other thing that's kind of elementary to me, Brandon, is just the personnel wide receiver. I look at this class of wide receivers Georgia just signed, and I don't think they're going to be world beaters and everything. I don't think they're going to change the SEC, but I think they will change Georgia. And my modest expectation for at least 3 or 4 of those names, Brandon, is I can see a Marcus Rosamine or Jermaine Burton, and maybe even a Justin Robinson now, doing some of the same things that Blaylock and Pickens did for Georgia, especially early on, maybe not that Sugar Bowl game for Pickens.
All right, so let me kind of play devil's advocate on this for a moment, because obviously the people who've watched us for a long time know that's what I want to be true. I want all of these guys to blossom and do well. However, the one thing I have to keep coming back to, honesty compels me to admit, that if Georgia's going to try to upgrade its offense without making drastic schematic changes, I don't think it's going to work. And the in-season results, I believe, are going to fall short of a national championship. Now, it's also fair to point out that Kirby Smart's not going to let the cat out of the bag about what he's truly thinking in terms of a new offense. We wouldn't have necessarily guessed he was on the verge of hiring Todd Monken before he did. Smart's prerogative is to keep all this close to the vest, and that's probably what he's doing here. But in terms of our own conversation about what might happen, the notion of that Georgia's going to get saved offensively by good players, we already have a track record to know that's not enough, because you mentioned Pickens and Blaylock both. I would submit in terms of freshman wide receivers. Now, there occasionally you have guys like, Jerry Jeudy and others who have fabulous freshman years. But for the most part, compared to all the freshman receivers in the country, the performance of Blaylock and Pickens was in pretty close to the 90th percentile, even higher for what you could expect from freshman receivers. But last year, those great freshmen playing as well as they did, different ways, but certainly in their moments, both fabulous freshman receivers, it still wasn't enough to not only make Georgia's offense good, at times not even make Georgia's offense serviceable. So the notion that in 2020, Georgia's also going to get saved by freshman receivers, we already know that freshman receivers alone aren't enough. And obviously Pickens is still there, and Kirby Smart mentioned him by name this morning. Dominic Blaylock's returning from injury. But from a statistical standpoint, Georgia's returning production from its receiver position really isn't all that different from what it was a year ago.
Yeah, I just come back to, I think a wild card would be a guy like Arian Smith. And if you're playing the devil's advocate card, maybe I need to be the angel advocate here. Yes, I think Todd Monken is going to do things differently. He's going to scheme up ways to get guys in space. You look at the way Georgia's recruiting, they're trying to bring in running backs that are less predictable. You and I both know when certain backs were in the game the last few years, Georgia was likely to do X or Y and maybe not X, Y, Z and double Z and double A. I think Arian Smith is a different dynamic when you bring him back to a Mecole Hardman type guy. And that is the fear factor of they better have somebody over the top of this receiver because this guy's going to beat you deep. I think also it's the wherewithal, using that word. Monken will get in Kirby Smart's face and say, this is how you need to change. This is what you hired me for. Is it going to look exactly like Southern Miss when Monken had 3,000-yard receivers and 2,000-yard rushers? I don't think so. But I think it's going to be a gradual change and a move. When you look at these things that are changing, Brandon, especially personnel and then philosophy-wise, if Georgia can get about 10%, 5%, I'm not talking play calling and percentage ratio here, but I think if Georgia can get more 10 personnel, more 20 personnel, things like that, where, sorry for all you tight end fans out there, but more receivers out on the field, more man beaters in coverage. I think that's going to give Georgia the ability to have a little bit sharper teeth on offense rather than the gradual physical Nick Saban offenses of old. You think about James Cook, you think about man beaters like a Jermaine Burton, maybe a brilliant Demetrius Robertson in his swan song at Georgia. Year two about Pickens is going to look a lot better than year one. I think just schematically in the way Georgia will play, it will offer a little bit more with the open up world, especially when you have a quarterback that can put that ball in the belly and pull it out with a lot of those RPO looks.
All right, speaking of quarterbacks, before we get into recruiting, let me also address one more thing that Kirby Smart said this morning, continuing to double down on the notion, as he has in the past, that grad transfers come in and compete for playing time. He even cited Tyler Catalina going all the way back to 2016 as an example of if you're a grad transfer and coming in here and start, you got to earn that job. But I asked Connor Riley this yesterday. I'll ask you the same question. How does the quote-unquote competition at quarterback get changed if we're talking about a shorter period of practices before the start of the season or just a altered offseason altogether? How can you still have a legitimate full-fledged quarterback competition splitting reps amongst a number of guys if you've also are dealing with a shortened period of practices before you play your first game?
Yeah, that's a good point, Brandon. I wonder if, everybody's talking about dates changing and practice periods changing and things like that. I wonder if the NCAA will eventually the green light comes on. I wonder if the NCAA will allow more of those 2-a-day or 3-a-day type practices, especially if only one of those is padded up. I do see that the learning curve or just the simple patience will be rather slim to bring along a young guy or to have a package for this guy versus another guy. I think it's going to fall upon a lot of the work that the guys will do on the board, a lot of the work that the guys have do establishing a leadership culture within the locker room. There's no discounting as much as Kirby Smart wants to play that, compete, earn your time, and earn your spot on the roster. That's the culture of the Georgia program. That's competition, Brandon. But when you think about Newman, you think about the physical ability. There's not a physical ability asset he won't check except for maybe that lightning speed like like a Lamar Jackson or a Justin Fields has, but he'll have the deep ball. He'll have the ability of playing experience. There won't be a way where people will look at Georgia and say that Georgia is deficient physically at the quarterback area anymore. I think it's just going to have to happen really fast. What's going to have to happen is Juwan Mathis and Carson Beck will get their shots, and then they'll have to impress right away. Otherwise, they'll get left behind in the curve.
All right, let's do some recruiting talk here for a moment on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And you've obviously written some really good stuff at DawgNation.com that I want to get to. Let me start with one more thing before that, though. I thought this was kind of fun. I guess five-star cornerback Tony Grimes recently celebrated a birthday, and the legendary former Georgia cornerback Champ Bailey reached out to him to wish him happy birthday. I'm here for all of this, Jeff. I love that. I love the notion of Grimes, first of all, being paired in a future secondary, the guy like Keely Ringo. That certainly gets my mouth watering just a bit. And the notion that Champ Bailey, who is a true DGD in every sense of the word, the fact that he's kind of giving a little bit of a nod in the direction of Grimes on Twitter, I'll take that. And the coronavirus shutdown, Jeff, when news is kind of at a premium, Champ Bailey talking to Tony Grimes, that is red meat for my audience, I can promise you.
Well, Brendan, let me throw a little bit more chum in the water for you right here. What did you like better that you were all here for? Did you like that Champ Bailey throwing out a shout out to Tony Grimes? Remember, Champ Bailey's really well known in the Washington, D.C. Tidewater area because he started so many years there for the Redskins. Do you like that better? Or do you like how Kirby Smart's highlights came up from the Georgia Vault on Twitter, and you have the father of Tony Grimes reacting to Kirby Smart being a baller, a stone-cold killer at defensive back? That's some Twitter on Twitter budding potential spring love right there.
That is very good, and it kind of leads me to a more serious question. Sure enough, Kirby really was a pretty good player. I can imagine, more than a pretty good player, he was a very good player in college. But my point is, for young players now, and maybe even their parents who kind of only know him as a coach, when you see him flying all over the field, making a lot of interceptions, a lot of really pretty athletic plays, I got to imagine for a lot of these recruits, that is a little bit of a surprise. He probably was a better player than the average recruit probably realizes until you see him on video, right?
I mean, this is going to be a frosty take, Brandon, but let me see if I can de-thaw this one a little bit. When you think of those interceptions, when you think how he was maybe a general back there on the field, he even had some sacks. He's picked off Tim Couch. He picked off Peyton Manning, I guess some of the big guys. He balled out that day in the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville as well. There's not a lot of Georgia safeties in recent memory you could name where you could clearly say that guy was a better player than Kirby Smart. And that's just the way of looking at it. I think J.R. Reed was definitely a better player. LeCount was a better player. Maybe Dominic Sanders was a better player. But he's in that name with Bakari Rambo, those great Georgia safeties of old. I bet if we had to name 5 or 10 best Georgia safeties of all time, everybody likes to trot out those listicles, Kirby Smart's name would definitely be on there.
All right, let's do a couple things. I want to finish with what I think maybe some bad news. So let me do one more good thing before we get there. I love your story with Jermaine Burton, the recent UGA wide receiver signee. I'm obviously really excited about Burton on the field for this upcoming season. And I guess my couple of takeaways on that. One is an opinion, one's more fact-based. Let me do the opinion thing first. How do you think Burton, I know Terrence Edwards went into great detail on this in your story, but in terms of those freshman receivers most likely to sort of pop right away, I know you've really touted for Burton on that, but make the comparison between someone like Justin Robinson, who's been on campus, had some Sugar Bowl practices, had an off-season workout program, even if no spring practice. That's not nothing in terms of his development for his freshman season. And then a guy on film, Marcus Roseme, and don't take this as a scouting report because I don't give those, but when I watch Roseme on film, what I see is a guy who looks like a wide receiver. Jeff, there are a lot of guys who play wide receiver in high school that sort of look like an athlete who got stuck out wide because they're the guy that runs the fastest and jumps the highest. Marcus Roseme looks like he's a trained wide receiver. And so when I think of him playing as a freshman, I think of him having some success because he kind of reminds me a little bit of what Blaylock was last year. Just a guy that really knows the position. So make that comparison between the spectacular athleticism of Burton, the polished skill set of Roseme, and now in Robinson's case, a little bit of experience. Yeah,
so let me kind of hit some of this stuff pretty quick. I think Roseme's potential is a better Riley Ridley and a more effective Riley Ridley coming out of the gate. He's 6'2", he's about 200. He's a willing blocker. if you had to think about all these Madden players out there, Brandon, I don't know if you're playing Madden yet with Charlie on the sticks yet, but he's about an 8 or a 9 in almost all the areas. He's really effective. And he's different than maybe even, it's more, Roseby's kind of a hybrid between Blaylock and Pickens. Maybe some of that size, some of that wiggle, some of that hands, which is very good comparative stakes right there. But, man, I remember you and I were doing a program. It was probably 3 or 4 months ago, and you asked me, okay, all these receivers, Jeff, who do you think is going to make the impact? And, Brandon, I don't even think you had the question out beyond those potential newbie on their way whiskers yet, where I blurted out Jermaine Burton, man, because Burton, this is going to sadden Connor Riley. And I think the world of Dominic Blaylock. But you think physically, you think moving the ball, moving around, short space quickness, 40, straight ahead, linear speed, ball skills, go up and get a ball, although he's only 6 feet tall, about 6'1". I think Burton's going to win a lot of those beauty contests when you look at Blaylock versus Burton. The other thing about Blaylock, he's such a marvelous athlete in space. He's a lot more shiftier, make a guy miss. I don't know if Burton has all that, but let's be clear. Jermaine Burton is not going to school right now. He is literally training and has been training for the last few months, Brandon, like he's getting ready for the NFL Combine. He's been groomed by Terrence Edwards. The breaks, the speed, the physicality is all there in any way. And I also noted in that story 2 things. I've noticed when I watched Jermaine Burton as a sophomore and a junior at the opening, he seemed to me like a guy that loved the flash. He loved the I want to make sure I say this correctly. He loved everything that went along with being a great football player. Some people could call that status, stars, offers, clout. Clout is a big word today with all the young people, Brandon. And gradually over the last year, I've seen all that change. He cut his hair. He's doubled down. He made the decision not to go to LSU because he liked all that flash, but he wondered about Joe Brady sticking around. He wondered about if LSU could replicate those things with Joe Burrow and Joe Brady no longer in the stead. And he thought about what mattered to him, and what mattered to him was playing in front of the people he loves the most. The 15 people he loves the most in the world, Brandon, all live in the state of Georgia. He wanted to ball out. He wanted to play for them. He wanted it not to be a hardship for them to come see him. And that's just a mature decision. He said he cut his hair. He feels a lot more mature. The other thing, Brandon, is I've seen this movie before. Jermaine Burton airdropped into IMG Academy in 2017. He was a sophomore. There were 2018 prospects who went on to Michigan, Miami, big-time spots, LSU. And Burton was a starter by week 3. He became a starter by week 3 against guys that were bigger, faster, stronger, that should have known the scheme more. He got on the field really fast, Brandon, because he jumped on huddle and learned everything he could soaking up that play. I've already seen this movie how Jermaine Burton wasn't supposed to play. He wasn't supposed to be able to swim in the deep end of the pool, and he made himself into the type of player that could do that. And now he's physically every bit the part where he's going to come in and athletically, step for step, be as good as Georgia has.
You mentioned the notion of a haircut. I vaguely remember what those are. For our audience that maybe has not had one of those in seemingly 6 months, could you just kind of refresh our memories about what a haircut actually is? Because for those who are watching us on video right now, my hair's gotten pretty long.
I will say this. I'm going to make myself look like Forrest Gump in that running across America scene. Yeah. First of all, DawgNation friends, family out there, viewers, if you're letting the kids, if you're letting the wife, if you're letting somebody else cut the hair, more power to you, man. But wow. All the people that are suffering in all this, Brandon, I think those service professionals, the one that we used to take for granted, and you get the ears lowered, it's a lot different in this day and age. And sooner or later, we're going to start doing a counter. Maybe Brandon can raise some money for charity or for first responders or frontline workers. Brandon, sooner or later, that beard's got to come down, right? You're not going to cut that. You're not going to shave until Georgia wins a natty, are you?
I don't know. Maybe at this point in time, maybe this is just a regular fixture. Maybe this is part of my new look. I've gotten more compliments than not, although I guess the people that don't like it probably are just going to keep that point to themselves. Let me do 2 quick things before we let you go. One more thing on Burton, and that is it was interesting to hear from family members in your story about his relationship with LSU prior to the decision to kind of flip away from them to come to Georgia. In having that conversation with them and maybe their expression of surprise by the fact that he actually ended up at UGA. How real with all of that with LSU in terms of that at one point in time seeming like his destination? How real was all of that?
Pretty real. I think it really just they thought about it more with more granular, and they really, once it got closer and closer to the decision time, Brandon, they really started to look. I'm sure that your ears will perk up on this, more chum in the water. But at the end of the day, Burton wasn't really sure about what LSU was telling him. They were telling him that Brady would be back. They were telling him there was also a couple of guys in the class at LSU that had a spot and then didn't have a spot. They kind of rubbed some recruits the right way. Reminder that the Tigers lost Rakeem Jarrett as well out of their dream OBJ type Jamar Chase, restocking of their recruiting class, Jarvis Landry, guys like that. They lost two prized receivers in the 2020 class, and LSU fans were kind of miffed about that. And I just think I remember hearing a story about once they were watching the events unfold at LSU after the national championship win, and Brady was gone in about 2 days, and Burrow was gone. The Burton family just thought to themselves, like, we had a really good read on that situation. Can you imagine if they would have signed and they would have went to Georgia, they would have went to LSU instead of Georgia? Yeah. Little backstory, Brennan, is it was always LSU and Georgia. When he chose LSU back in the spring of 2019, it was LSU or Georgia. I think we gotta apply the Isaac Nauta method here as well. I think Jermaine Burton going off to Florida and then going off to California made him realize how much he missed being within the home state of Georgia, being within an hour of all of his friends and family. And that absence made the heart grow fonder for him to want to come back and play for Georgia.
All right, last thing, and this is kind of getting back to old times here with me fretting about some online chatter, but there has been a decent amount of that last 24, 48 hours a bit when it comes to Barrett Carter, the linebacker from North Gwinnett, Clemson, who is absolutely a thorn in my side. I cannot wait to play that bunch in 2021, or hopefully sooner maybe even, but in a college football playoff this year, but 2021 at the very least. Georgia needs to play Clemson head-to-head because Clemson is a nemesis on the recruiting trail, and while I won't pretend to know what Carter's eventual destination is, he is a player that I like. I used to live in Swanee, so I got a little bit of an affection for that North Gwinnett program. What's going on here? Is Carter Clemson bound, do you think?
Well, Brandon, at first you got to realize all this is just crystal ball chatter. I don't think Barrett Carter had an incredible phone call with Dabo Swinney compared to an incredible FaceTime with Glenn Schumann or Kirby Smart. I don't think a player of substance like that is going to let one school maybe overcome an edge or move forward just over the basis of shelter-in-place quarantine recruiting. I'm sure that there'll be a list that comes out at one point where which staff was the best recruiting staff during COVID-19 or who had the best COVID-19 recruiting season. But, you want to talk about thorns in your side, Brandon. Ohio State is another one. They just picked up another gargantuan commitment yesterday and another defensive line commitment. They're coming for that number one spot as well. And I guess with Barrett, I think the thing that's different, because we have some people in the DawgNation forum that are already comparing it to Miles Murphy. Well, yeah. The hard part there is Georgia just couldn't get Miles Murphy back on campus after his junior season, whereas Carter's going to take his visits. He's been taking his visits. He feels prioritized. There's a lot of people in Barrett Carter's circle that do like the fact that he might play football close to home. And I put something up on the forum which basically gauges how I feel about this. And I rattled off a bunch of names, Brandon. Brian Brzee, Noah, Eric Gilbert, Theo Johnson, Zach Pickens. You see where I'm going with this, on and on. These were a bunch of good players that Georgia didn't get or didn't end up with. And that's not the patented recruiting industry. Oh, no, here comes the guy letting us down for a letdown and slowly preparing the trees or whatever, slowly marinating things. I don't think that's the case at all. What I just simply meant to say is that, Barrett Carter is a phenomenal football player. He's going to make his own decision. Clemson is a very strong brand. They've got one of his best buddies in the world, Jordan Hancock. Brandon, I don't know if you know the backstory on Hancock, but he had already picked out everything short of bed sheets for Ohio State for his dorm room when a sudden quick visit to Clemson changed all that. Okay. And he did have a great visit. Barrett Carter did see Clemson prior to the shutdown. So, Barrett Carter is a guy that's maintained that he's going to take his visits. He wants to do it before his senior year. And I think he still wants to kind of go through some due diligence. But that having been said, man, everybody that's going to predict things that are happening right now and how young people feel and how they're going through this shutdown down. Anybody that applies what they know from their years of recruiting experience or feelings or situations in this industry, anyone that tries to cookie cutter that stuff right now based on what they've seen before in the past, I think it's kind of reckless because we've never been through this before.
Real quick, final thing, and I promise we can keep this short, but it seems appropriate if we're going to say Barrett Carter, maybe thinking about somewhere else, it seems appropriate to finish then with a quick update on Smile Mondon, who a lot of folks, if you're talking about favorite inside linebackers for the upcoming class, Mondon may be the favorite of the majority of our listeners anyway, which not to say that Barrett's not or should say that Barrett Carter's not a sensational player, but Mondon is already very popular with the UGA fans. So if Carter is a challenged recruitment right now, where does that leave George and Smile Mondon?
Yeah, Smile Mondon was not in any hurry making his decision prior to this shutdown. He wanted to wait his entire senior season. He wanted his Paulding County teammates to get looks. He wanted to do it around December, if not later. He's not going to enroll early at Georgia. That's not the plan as last we spoke. So, Smile Mondon, and this is a good test, Brandon. I want you to answer this question, and I want everybody out there on the feed to answer this question as well. Brandon, if there's one recruit that the online chatter or the Crystal Ball Nation started pointing them in a different direction than Georgia in the class, which one of them would make you clutch your pearls the fastest? Is it Mr. Carter? Would it be James Williams? Would it be Amarius Mims? Would it be Tony Grimes? For you, which one of those would really raise your eyebrows the most?
I think it might be Mondon from the standpoint of, if we assume that, let's just for the sake of conversation say that Carter does end up at Clemson. If Georgia were to somehow not be trending with Mondon, that'd be kind of eye-opening given the fact that Georgia did not really recruit the linebacker position last year. They looked at M.J. Sherman and said, that's all the linebackers that we need, and obviously that's a very good one to get. But Georgia had been so heavy linebackers the previous class. So I kind of think of linebacker as a low-key need for Georgia right now, just given that you're going to have some attrition at that position. You're going to have, some needs to fill there. So I guess a guy like Mondon might be near the top of my list just because it's the classic story of you didn't prioritize that position in the last recruiting cycle, and for a defensive-minded program like Georgia means there's an extra emphasis on that for this upcoming cycle as well.
Brandon, let me give you I've been using this term a lot. Let me give you a chance to give me your best Fred G. Sanford impersonation right now and have a heart attack. Here's the doomsday scenario. Let's say Georgia whiffs on both Barrett Carter and Smile Mondon Jr. Guess who Georgia still has already on the program at linebacker? I'm not talking about Quay Walker, N'Kobe Dean, or Monty Rice, or even Channing Tindall. Everybody forgets also Tresman Marshall and Rian Davis as well. Both of those guys were top 100 players in the 2019 class. Those are guys who are also biding their time to get on the field at Georgia. There's a reason why Georgia could back off the sticks a little bit with the inside linebacker spot. By no means am I sitting there and saying that, Georgia can weather the chance that they would lose both Mondon and Carter. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is the incredible depth that this program has, where you're really, if Georgia signs and brings in a Smile Mondon and a Barrett Carter, look at things, Brandon. I think the only name that we mentioned that won't be back would be Monty Rice, likely, at least as far as eligibility goes for the 2021 team. So that would still leave N'Kobe Dean, Channing Tindall, Tresman Marshall, Quay Walker, and then the two freshmen as well. I think it was necessary for me to say that because it shows just where Georgia's at. They have recruited so well. And, yeah, they missed a bunch of players. I documented a bunch of players at Georgia, put their big boy britches on and rolled up their sleeves and tried to go and get, and they missed. And yet we look at this roster, Brandon, and I can safely say that this is the deepest and talented Georgia defense that we've ever seen. And it's as deep and talented in a lot of places as Kirby Smart has ever put together in Athens.
Well, I told you when you first came on, Jeff, that we wouldn't keep you very long. We'll get you a chance to get on with your day, and yet we've ended up going nearly half an hour. So I really appreciate your time. Really, really good stuff all the way around. Just incredible information. We'll look forward to reading more from you at the forum at forum.dawgnation.com, on the website at dawgnation.com. And then because this is Thursday, again this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern time on the DawgNation video channels for a live edition of the Cover 4. Jeff gives you the Four Horsemen sign there, which, listen, I'm all about that. I don't know which horseman Jeff would be, but I guess we can debate that another time. But we appreciate you being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Right, it got to be Flair or Luger, baby. I'm going to go for one of those two, man. You could be Dusty Rhodes when he joined the Horsemen for a little bit of a time or whatever, man. But, hey, get your fours up, everybody. Cover 4's coming up later today.
All right, good stuff there from Jeff Sintel, and thanks to all of you for being with us here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp as well. We got some time for your comments here coming up, too. And I guess the one thing I'll say about the comparison, I think it's interesting that Jeff brings this up from the forum, the notion that Barrett Carter, the linebacker from North Gwinnett's a little bit like last year's version of Miles Murphy. I guess the one thing that I would push back on that a little bit about, and I'll take your comments about this, is that for me, Murphy was always obviously a very good fit for Clemson, a defensive end in a 4-3 alignment. Murphy always said that. Look, the notion that somehow Carter's not a schematic fit for Georgia, that seems difficult for me to ascertain. I get why the comparison gets made in terms of an in-state guy, sort of metro Atlanta guy that you're having, a difficult time keeping away from Clemson. I get that part of the comparison, but from a schematic standpoint, obviously Murphy was an obvious fit for Clemson in a way that Georgia could not really sell that quite as much the same way. So with all of that in mind, let me hop over here. We'll take a few more of your comments on Facebook and YouTube. I know we're a little bit late getting to the comments, so we will fly through those as much as we possibly can. I agree with Phil Rogers, who says that Georgia needs a defensive tackle that can get after the quarterback. Really, all of those guys along the line of scrimmage. Georgia's going to be more impactful in that backfield. I talked about that on the podcast edition of the show yesterday. The one thing that I begrudgingly gave Florida some credit for was that Florida was able to keep it closer with LSU last season than Georgia did. It was tied at the half. It was within one score late in the game. LSU eventually won by 2 touchdowns, whereas Georgia was down 17 at the half and down 34-3 in the third quarter. And I think if you're looking for Georgia as a national championship contender for the upcoming season, the one thing you can't do is just sort of simply gloss over that game and pretend that the LSU game last year didn't happen. Then you have to look and see what Georgia did not have against LSU and say, how does Georgia find that for the upcoming season? And as the commenter mentioned, getting after quarterbacks more, that for me is undoubtedly a missing piece in Georgia's national championship puzzle. Do I think it can all come together this year? Obviously. There's a great chance that Georgia wins this season's national championship, but that's not going to happen without big-time upgrades in what you do defensively near the line of scrimmage and big-time upgrades in what you do offensively to generate more explosive plays. Absent those two big things, pass rush, explosive plays on offense, Georgia's going to fall short of a national championship. However, it's well within its own control to upgrade both of those areas as we get ready to begin the upcoming season. A couple more Facebook comments. We'll pop over to YouTube here in a moment. Sheldon Tucker says, I hope you wear a mask out in public. You need to try to tell these people to wear the mask. They might listen to you. So the mask thing is obviously pretty weird because at one point in time, the so-called experts were saying don't wear a mask, and now in some places it's illegal not to wear a mask. Honestly, we kind of stay away from most of that, all the way around. Although when my wife went out to the supermarket yesterday, checking out our friends at Kroger, she did have a mask on. So we actually do have a couple of masks, and my wife was wearing one yesterday. So there you go. Let's do a couple more here. All right, let me pop over to the YouTube side of things here for a moment. Kind of check in with those folks and see how they're doing here today. Green Soldier, good to see him in here. Hunter Davis brings up an interesting point. He says the only game UGA can afford to lose in the regular season is the Alabama game. It is really interesting that even though I think symbolically there's a lot on the line when Georgia takes on Alabama, for the head coach that loses it, he's going to face a lot of criticism after that game. If Nick Saban loses it, you're going to look at Saban and say, wow, you've lost your most recent game to Ed Orgeron, your most recent game to Gus Malzahn, and now your most recent game to Kirby Smart. You've also been beaten by Dabo Swinney a couple times in the last half decade. The mystique of Nick Saban as this unconquerable head coach, it kind of goes away if he's got current losing streaks to 3 of the big boys in the SEC and kind of recently manhandled by Dabo Swinney and Clemson. So from a perception standpoint, a loss against Georgia would be pretty damaging to Nick Saban's reputation. Conversely, you can say a similar thing about Kirby Smart and Georgia. If Smart were to lose again to Nick Saban, his third head-to-head loss, especially given that the first 2 losses kind of seemed like he let the game slip away from him, that would also be pretty damaging to his reputation. So symbolically, for the coach who loses the Georgia-Alabama game in September, there's going to be kind of a lot at stake. However, Hunter's point about the college football playoff race, even though we'll hype up the game in a major way and, treat it as the most important regular season game that Kirby Smart has played, and on paper it kind of looks that way. The truth is you can overcome a loss in that game. Really, both programs kind of can overcome that loss, whereas were you to lose another game in the SECs, like say to Florida, the kind of game where a head-to-head loss could keep you from winning the division that's potentially much more damaging. So I think that Hunter is right on the facts of that. I do think that's probably true. Let me get in here and get a few more of these comments. Let's see what else is going on over here. I like this. Stacy Goebel says, today feels like the first traditional DawgNation show we've had in a minute. Can't wait to get back to normal. Stacy, I'm glad that feels that way to you. Honestly, we're trying to do as traditional a show as we can. Some of the bells and whistles that we do for the show when we're in the studio, it's just really, really challenging to do here at home. You know, we have kind of incorporated more of the guests in, which has been really fun. Sometimes I joke that our technology is a little bit like Sex Panther from the movie Anchorman. 60% of the time, it works every time. You know, Jeff's audio quality, maybe not perfect. Hopefully that doesn't get on your nerves too much. I'd say the same thing to the podcast audience. You know, hopefully a little bit of a skip or a hiccup every now and then is tolerable. If it's not, please reach out to me on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. Let me know if it's annoying. We can try to figure out, some alternative as far as what to do about that. Sometimes I feel like we'll have a COVID vaccine before we kind of figure out all of this stuff in terms of getting all of our teammates on the screen here together at the same time. But nonetheless, we sort of appreciate all of you kind of getting ready for and being a part of what we're doing here. Really appreciate that. Let's get a few more comments. Mike D says, give me your reason for concern on our team besides pass rushers. What needs to be addressed in your opinion? So Mike D, I'll say it. Pass rush is obviously one of those. The second thing is producing those explosive plays on offense. And I think that producing those explosive plays is going to take more than just an upgrade in talent. Because from a recruiting standpoint, Georgia was loaded last season, even at the wide receiver position. It's one of the reasons why I've kind of always pushed back on those, including some of our own teammates here at DawgNation, who want to lay all of the blame for Georgia's unsuccessful offense last season at the feet of the wide receivers. The reason why I know that's not true is because if you had an old school expansion draft, if all the players in the Georgia roster became available to the rest of the SEC or the rest of the Power 5 programs in college football, it is not like people would have looked at Georgia's receivers a year ago and just sort of skipped over picking them to take somebody else. Had the Georgia receivers been on the open market a year ago, plenty of programs would have been glad to scarf up a lot of those players. So the notion that Georgia, failed last season offensively because of its receivers, that has always been too simplistic of a take for me. So when you look ahead to 2020, and I address this kind of near the top of the program, that somehow the playmakers are going to be what determines the success of the Georgia offense. I think that's understating the role that scheme plays in all of this. I think you've got to have a competent offensive coordinator that's designing an offensive scheme that gets players open. Now, Kirby Smart does not need to, nor should he, go on a radio interview in Atlanta and sort of lay out all of the ways in which that's going to happen. He has the right to some secrecy, especially given the fact that he has a chance to sort of spring this on the world come September, and I do believe he'll be playing games in September. But beyond that, or at least I assume it will be. But beyond that, if we were to take him at his word to say this is more about what the playmakers do, more so than the kind of scheme we draw up, that sounds very similar to what James Coley said before the start of last season, and we know ultimately how that worked out. So, Mike D, I'm glad you asked the question. That's my two things. The difference between Georgia and a national championship is sacking quarterbacks more and creating more explosive plays. If Georgia does those two things, and it's the same thing, by the way, I'll go back and find the audio on this. I don't mean to be preachy, but it's the same thing I said last summer. Georgia going into the start of the season. Can you get after quarterbacks? Can you make explosive plays? If you can, you're a national champion. If you can't, you may fall short. I think that prediction proved true a year ago, even though I'm not glad it happened, but that prediction ultimately proved true. Georgia fell short in both those regards, and as a season, it also fell short. So the missing formula for Georgia, one thing on defense, one thing on offense. Getting after quarterbacks, more impactful behind the line of scrimmage, and creating more explosive plays that allows the offense to keep things moving. Those are my two things. And obviously, I'd love to give people a chance to kind of weigh in on that there as well. Green Soldier says, did you see that Nick Chubb put down that Texas versus Georgia football player state-by-state comparison? Chubb doesn't talk much, but when he does, yeah, I kind of like that. And, I've got a lot of crackpot theories and sort of ludicrous hot takes. I guess one of the more out there ones I've always had is, and maybe at some point in time I'll do more to address this. I'm a big believer that Texas high school football is overrated. That in comparison to a state like Georgia, which, produces quarterbacks now, has always produced running backs, always produced linemen, probably been the hotbed for defensive linemen. In Texas, when you look at my sort of thumbnail sketch caricature of what Texas high school football is about, the best 11 players on the roster all play offense. I mean, the Texas high school football scene is the state that largely populates most of the Big 12 rosters. When you watch the Big 12, what do you see? Very good offenses on virtually every single program, pretty bad defenses virtually everywhere, including the recent gold standard Oklahoma. They don't play any defense at all. And it's that Texas high school football mentality that kind of produces that. Are there plenty of dazzling athletes that have come to the state of Texas? Obviously there are. And the size of the state and its commitment to football means they're going to have a lot of elite prospects every single year. But there is kind of an inherent philosophy associated with Texas high school football that, to me, always leaves something to be desired. Frankly, Georgia high school football is just tougher than Texas. It just is. And it's that toughness that's instilled into the SEC because Georgians are playing across the entire landscape of the SEC, not obviously just for UGA. Conversely, Texans are all across the Big 12, and you see what that league looks like year in, year out. It's that, football does not start from the top and work its way down. It starts from the bottom and works its way up. And the philosophies, the dominant prevailing ideas that exist in Texas high school football are what work their way up into the Big 12. And you see what is essentially a two-hand touch brand of football. The great defensive linemen, the great physical linebackers. That's the kind of thing that you come to Georgia for. And that's what ends up around the rest of the SEC. Let me get a few more here. Johnny Lester on YouTube says, the challenge of shortened overall practice times and missed spring should be greatly compensated at UGA by our army of 32 paid analysts in terms of teaching the playbook. I do think that's true, that the programs who have more resources in that regard are going to really benefit from those resources in terms of what they're able to provide for the teams. And I think a lot of the analysts end up being kind of self-scouters and scouting reports for future opponents. But if you're creating a winning game plan on short notice, and it very well maybe that's the way that all this plays out. But if you're trying to build a winning game plan on short notice, then obviously having an army of analysts, as Johnny points out, is a good way to do that. We're going to transition here into our R.S. Andrews cool down. I'll remind you, air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. Last night it was cold. We had the heat on back in my house again. It has been, I don't know that we've had the heat on. Maybe, was this the first time during the shutdown we've had on the heat? Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. We did have it on last night, and if you try to turn yours back on and you realize it wasn't working, it's just one of those systems in your house that R.S. Andrews does expert work on. Air conditioning units as well. We're about to have those on a bunch in the days to come, months to come. You want to make sure yours is working. R.S. Andrews can do a tune-up to make sure your system's back to factory fresh specs. If your water heater goes out, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can also replace that for you in the same day. Story after story. R.S. Andrews has been delivering smiles, and they can deliver a smile for you, but you've got to find them online at rsandrews.com. Dari and the whole team over there, they're big college football fans. Dari's been with us on a lot of our DawgNation invasions and things like that. And, of course, they're just fun to do business with. They love the kind of college football conversation we have here on our program each and every day, and it's my invitation to you to reach out to them and allow them to do some great work for you around your home for any kind of heating, electrical, plumbing, or air conditioning system situation you may be dealing with online once again at rsandrews.com. Let's get a couple more comments, and then we're going to have to get off the air so I can get the podcast rocking and rolling and ready to go. Christy says she's a Bears fan, not fond of the Falcons. Well, if you're a Bears fan right now, it's kind of fun because you've had some UGA guys kind of coming through there, which has been kind of neat. Bank 6 lives in New Mexico. I didn't know that. He says it snowed there last week. That's pretty crazy. I had no idea. I didn't even know it snowed at all in New Mexico. That's pretty crazy. Doug Rayburn says it was 35 in Carrollton this morning. That's also pretty crazy there as well. Let's do a couple more things. Let's see what else is kind of going on over here. Try to find some good Facebook stuff. So yesterday I kind of criticized the YouTube folks for being off topic. Today it seems like the Facebook folks are kind of off topic as well. I like Lindsey Hardman's comment though that says we need to stay as the number one defense for years to come. Yeah, I definitely think that brand for Georgia of being a dominant defense is a very good brand, and it obviously makes Georgia very difficult to game plan against. And this is one of those things where I just think the media, and it's not like a sort of, ad hominem media attack, but I just think it's just a basic fact that we have a tendency to treat the offensive coaches, and I'm probably the same way. we have a tendency to treat the offensive coaches as like super geniuses, and we treat the defensive coaches as something other than that. We just don't treat football acumen like schematic stuff. We don't treat that as brilliantly as we treat the offensive stuff. But I would say that if you're talking about going up against a Kirby Smart defense, one that's obviously Dan Lanning, chief lieutenant, and even Mel Tucker before that, that the kind of work that the offensive coaches have to do to get ready to deal with the Kirby Smart defense, I would say there's just as much coaching time to prepare for that as there is getting ready to deal with one of these, really high-powered offenses. The same way that the defensive staffs are sweating bullets about having to go up against Joe Brady or going up against Lane Kiffin or one of these guys, Steve Sarkisian maybe, one of these guys that's sort of thought of as a brilliant play-calling mind. I would say that game planning to deal with a Kirby Smart defense is just as challenging. And I think that, as Lindsay said, that's part of the brand that Georgia has in terms of the best defensive recruits want to play here, and the teams that have to battle against Georgia know what they're up against in terms of a defense that's very hard to score on and can really make you look bad if you don't have all your ducks in a row, and if you're not willing to commit to being physical. I think she's absolutely right about that. I think that's a really good point all the way around. We're going to get ready to wrap up for you right now. We got a podcast to get ready to put out there. I'll look forward to seeing you as a part of that later on today. It'll show up on all the various podcast platforms, Apple, the Google Player, Spotify, worldfamousdognation.com. Many of you listen directly through SoundCloud. Good stuff. More on what Kirby Smart said this morning on the Atlanta radio station 680 The Fan. Also, continuing to follow the coronavirus over at the AJC. Make sure you check out ajc.com for more on that, including what's going on in Albany right now, probably the hot spot outside the city of Atlanta for our state. An update on that. Some fun stuff from Steve Hummer, who's done great work on the sports side of things. We need that kind of lighthearted, fun stuff to kind of keep people entertained. Steve's doing a good job at that over at ajc.com there as well. And kind of a really good look at just some of the really fun things going on with the Atlanta Braves as well. Check out ajc.com for more on that. It's ajc.com for Atlanta News Now. Unparalleled coronavirus coverage. That's not as much fun, but it's important right now. The AJC provides that, so make sure you check that out at ajc.com. Let me tell you what is fun, though. That's our Gator Hater Updater. And it's great to be able to tell you that it's now been 1,265 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. Our buddy Eddie loves that. That's great news today here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Huge thanks to them for making all this possible. Check them out online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. We'll see you this afternoon for the Cover 4 Live on the DawgNation video channels. I'll have you for the podcast. DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Coming up in just a moment, you'll hear from Kirby Smart, his interview from 680 The Fan on that show here today. And back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. We'll look forward to speaking to you then, everybody.
you